Hello, welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are continuing Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, starting with Part 2, Chapter 3. Reading updates. I stopped reading The Truth is a Flightless Bird by Akbar Hussein because it wasn't my jam. It wasn't for me. Did not like. It's fine. I can see other people enjoying it, but I just didn't care about the characters and I didn't care about like how the plot was going to go. It's a really cool concept. It was a really cool plot idea. I liked that it was taking place in Nairobi, which is really fun. I haven't read a lot of books with that setting. Um, but it just wasn't for me. So I stopped reading that on last Friday, and instead I just went back to reading The Walking Dead. I'm on the fourth compendium, which is the last compendium, and let me tell you, it's a honker. It is massive. It's over there. I'm not gonna grab it, but it's really big. Trust me. Um, I think that's all I'm like currently reading. I think so. I've mostly been watching One Piece. He's a chunky boy. Exactly. But today, we are reading Frankenstein, and I'm so excited. So we're starting with we're starting with part 2, chapter 3. And let me see if I remember. I mean, I remember what happened last time. The hardest part for these recaps is always, okay, but like, where did it start last time? Okay, let's see. Mm, I don't remember. That was my attempt at remembering. Um, but what is about to happen? So Victor is, oh, okay. I think I remember where we left or where we started last time. Uh, Victor is going back home. He already had plans to go back home, and he received a letter from his father saying that his brother has been murdered. His dad was like, I thought about just telling you the date, but I really want you to know what's going on here. So your brother's been murdered. Come home. So Victor comes home with his friend Clerval, Henry Clerval, something like that. And they go through the murder trial, and the person who is accused is an old town friend. She is innocent. She didn't actually do it. She just happened to be out all night that night, and she had like a trinket that belonged to Victor's brother in her pocket. So she, in the trial, she just like decides to say that she did it, thinking that she would be absolved from all of this and we could just all be happy and everything would be tied up in a bow. That's not how it worked. She was convicted and they killed her. She died in prison. So, to the family is distressed about that. Elizabeth, Victor's cousin, is super sad because they were really close and she always believed that this girl didn't actually do it. And so to sort of like get away from their grief, because everyone's like, Victor, you're taking this like really hard. And Victor's like, yeah, I know, because my monster did this. He didn't tell anybody that, but that's like his inner thoughts, his inner monologue. And so like his dad is like, Victor, you are a sad sack. Let's go on vacation. So they go on vacation to sort of like get a change of location, get a change of mindset, all these kinds of things. Victor does every once in a while have happy moments, and his cousin Elizabeth is like, you should never be sad ever again because you're so much more fun to be around when you're happy. And Victor's like, wouldn't that be nice? Um, and so he goes up a mountain and he sees somebody in the distance, and they move inhumanly fast, and he's like, holy crap, it's my monster. So he goes up to his monster and he starts like yelling at him, and the monster's like, excuse me, rude, but like in Shakespearean, because that's how he talks apparently. And the monster is like, okay, look, dude, you need to deal with what you've done. You've created me, deal with it. And also, I will either live up in the mountains in peace, in harmony, and all of these other things, or I can live with the humans and everyone will hate me. And also, I may or may not kill everybody in your family. And so Victor's like, tough choice. What am I gonna do? And then the monster's like, come with me. Let me spin a tale. So now they're going to Frankenstein's monster's place. And then he's gonna talk to him about, like, everything that has happened, like, his side of the story. And I think that's everything. All right. Let's have a sip. And then let's do it. Here we go. Part 2, Chapter 3. It is with considerable difficulty that I remembered the original area of my being. All the events of that period appear confused and indistinct. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard, and smelt at the same time, and it was, indeed, a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of my various senses. By degrees, I remember, a stronger light pressed upon my nerves, so that I was obliged to shut my eyes. Darkness then came over me and troubled me, but hardly had I felt this, when, by opening my eyes, as I now suppose, the light poured in upon me again. I walked, and, I believed, descended. But I presently found a great alteration in my sensations. Before, dark and opaque bodies had surrounded me, impervious to my touch or sight, but I now found that I could wander on at liberty, with no obstacles which I could not either surmount or avoid. The light became more and more oppressive to me, and the heat wearying me as I walked, I sought a place where I could receive shade. This was the forest near Ingolstadt, and here I lay by the side of a brook, resting from my fatigue, until I felt tormented by hunger and thirst. This roused me from my nearly dormant state, and I ate some berries which I found hanging on the trees, or lying on the ground. I slaked my thirst at the brook, and then lying down, was overcome by sleep. It was dark when I awoke. I felt cold, also, and half frightened, as it were instinctively, finding myself so desolate. Before I had quitted your apartment, on a sensation of cold, I had covered myself with some clothes, but these were insufficient to secure me from the dews of night. I was a poor, helpless, miserable wretch. I knew and could distinguish nothing, but, feeling pain invade me on all sides, I sat down and wept. Soon a gentle light stole over the heavens and gave me a sensation of pleasure. I started up and beheld a radiant form rise from among the trees. I gazed with a kind of wonder. It moved slowly, but it enlightened my path, and I again went out in search of berries. I was still cold, when under one of the trees I found a huge cloak, with which I covered myself and sat down upon the ground. You know what I just realized? The cereal Frankenberry? Did it come from Frankenstein? Like, actually? Because this Frankenstein's monster is on the hunt for berries. This is amazing. I'm so excited. Everyone's just like, yeah, duh. Of course it did. And I'm just like, yeah, of course, Frankenberries, sure. I get it. Oh my gosh, such a dingbat. Okay. Okay. Several changes of day and night passed, and the orb of night had greatly lessened when I began to distinguish my sensations from each other. I gradually saw plainly the clear stream that supplied me with drink, and the trees that shaded me with their foliage. I was delighted when I first discovered that a pleasant sound, which often saluted my ears, proceeded from the throats of the little winged animals who had often intercepted the light from my eyes. I began also to observe with greater accuracy the forms that surrounded me, and to perceive the boundaries of the radiant roof of light which canopied me. Sometimes I tried to imitate the pleasant songs of the birds, but was unable. Sometimes I wished to express my sensations in my own mode, but the uncouth and inarticulate sounds which broke from me frightened me into silence again. The moon had disappeared from the night, and again, with a lessened form, shewed itself, while I still remained in the forest. My sensations had, by this time, become distinct, and my mind received every day additional ideas. My eyes became accustomed to the light, and to perceive objects in their right forms. I distinguished the insect from the herb, and, by degrees, one herb from another. I found that the sparrow uttered none but harsh notes, whilst those of the blackbird and thrush were sweet and enticing. One day, when I was oppressed by cold, I found a fire which had been left by some wandering beggars, and was overcome with delight at the warmth I experienced from it. In my joy I thrust my hand into the live embers, but quickly drew it out again with a cry of pain. How strange, I thought, that the same cause should produce such opposite effects. I examined the materials of the fire, and to my joy found it to be composed of wood. I quickly collected some branches, but they were wet and would not burn. I was pained at this, and sat still watching the operation of the fire. The wet wood which I had placed near the heat dried, and itself became inflamed. I reflected on this, and, by touching the various branches, I discovered the cause, and busied myself in collecting a great quantity of wood, that I might dry it, and have a plentiful supply of fire. When night came on, and brought sleep with it, I was in the greatest fear lest my fire should be extinguished. I covered it carefully with dry wood and leaves, and placed wet branches upon it, and then, spreading my cloak, I lay on the ground and sunk into sleep. It was morning when I awoke, and my first care was to visit the fire. I uncovered it, and a gentle breeze quickly fanned it into a flame. I observed this also, and contrived a fan of branches, which roused the embers when they were nearly extinguished. When night came again, I found, with pleasure, that the fire gave light as well as heat, and that the discovery of this element was useful to me in my food, for I found some of the offals that the travelers had left had been roasted, and tasted much more savory than the berries I gathered from the trees. I tried, therefore, to dress my food in the same manner, placing it on the live embers. I found that the berries were spoiled by this operation, and the nuts and roots much improved. Food, however, became scarce, and I often spent the whole day searching in vain for a new acorn to assuage the pangs of hunger. When I found this, I resolved to quit the place that I had hitherto inhabited, to seek for one where the few wants I experienced would be more easily satisfied. In this emigration, I exceedingly lamented the loss of the fire which I had obtained through accident, and knew not how to reproduce it. I gave several hours to the serious consideration of this difficulty, but I was obliged to relinquish all attempt to supply it, and, wrapping myself up in my cloak, I struck across the wood towards the setting sun. I passed 3 days in these rambles, and at length discovered the open country. A great fall of snow had taken place the night before, and the fields were of one uniform white. The appearance was disconsolate, and I found my feet chilled by the cold, damp substance that covered the ground. It was about 7 in the morning, and I longed to obtain food and shelter. At length I perceived a small hut on a rising ground which had doubtless been built for the convenience of some shepherd. This was a new sight to me, and I examined the structure with great curiosity. Finding the door open, I entered. An old man sat in it near a fire, over which he was preparing his breakfast. He turned on hearing a noise, and, perceiving me, shrieked loudly, and quitting the hut, ran across the fields with a speed of which his debilitated form hardly appeared capable. His appearance, different from any I had ever seen, and his flight somewhat surprised me. But I was enchanted by the appearance of the hut. Here the snow and rain could not penetrate. The ground was dry, and it presented to me then an exquisite and divine a retreat as pandemonium appeared to the demons of hell after their suffering in the lake of fire. I greedily devoured the remnants of the shepherd's breakfast, which consisted of bread, cheese, milk, and wine. The latter, however, I did not like. Then, overcome by fatigue, I lay down among some straw and fell asleep. It was noon when I awoke, and, allured by the warmth of the sun, which shone brightly on the white ground, I determined to recommence my travels, and, depositing the remains of the peasant's breakfast in a wallet I found, I proceeded across the fields for several hours, until at sunset I arrived at a village. How miraculous did this appear! The huts, the neater cottages, and stately houses engaged my admiration by turns. The vegetables in the gardens, the milk and cheese that I saw placed at the windows of some of the cottages, allured my appetite. One of the best of these I entered, but I had hardly placed my foot within the door before the children shrieked, and one of the women fainted. The whole village was roused. Some fled, some attacked me, until, grievously bruised by stones and many other kinds of missile weapons, I escaped to the open country, and fearfully took refuge in a low hovel, quite bare, and making a wretched appearance after the palaces I had beheld in the village. This hovel, however, joined a cottage of a neat and pleasant appearance, but, after my late dearly bought experience, I dared not enter it. My place of refuge was constructed of wood, but so low that I could with difficulty sit upright in it. No wood, however, was placed on the earth which formed the floor, but it was dry, and although the winds entered it by innumerable chinks, I found it an agreeable asylum from the snow and rain. Here then I retreated, and lay down, happy to have found a shelter, however miserable, from the inclemency of the season, and still more from the barbarity of man. As soon as morning dawned, I crept from my kennel, that I might view the adjacent cottage, and discover if I could remain in the habitation I had found. It was situated against the back of the cottage, and surrounded on the sides, which were exposed by a pigsty and a clear pool of water. One part was open, and by that I had crept in, but now I covered every crevice by which I might be perceived with stones and wood, yet in such a manner that I might move them on occasion to pass out. All the light I enjoyed came through this sty, and that was sufficient for me. Having thus arranged my dwelling and carpeted it with clean straw, I retired, for I saw the figure of a man at a distance, and I remembered too well my treatment the night before to trust myself in his power. I had first, however, provided for my sustenance for that day by a loaf of coarse bread, which I purloined, and a cup with which I could drink, more conveniently than from my hand, of the pure water which flowed by my retreat. The floor was a little raised, so that it was kept perfectly dry, and by its vicinity to the chimney of the cottage it was tolerably warm. Being thus provided, I resolved to reside in this hovel until something should occur which might alter my determination. It was indeed a paradise compared to the bleak forest, my former residence, the rain-dropping branches, and dank earth. I ate my breakfast with pleasure, and was about to remove a plank to procure myself a little water, when I heard a step, and, looking through a small hole, I beheld a young creature, with a pail on her head, passing before my hovel. The girl was small, and of gentle demeanor, unlike what I have since found cottagers and farmhouse servants to be. Yet she was meanly dressed, a coarse blue petticoat and a linen jacket being her only garb. Her fair hair was plaited, but not adorned. She looked patient, yet sad. I lost sight of her, and in about a quarter of an hour she returned, bearing the pail, which was now partly filled with milk. As she walked along, seemingly incommoded by the burden, a young man met her, whose countenance expressed a deeper despondence. Uttering a few sounds with an air of melancholy, he took the pail from her head and bore it to the cottage himself. She followed, and they disappeared. Presently I saw the young man again, with some tools in his hand, cross the field behind the cottage, and the girl was also busied, sometimes in the house and sometimes in the yard. On examining my dwelling, I found that one of the windows of the cottage had formerly occupied a part of it, but the panes had been filled up with wood. In one of these was a small and almost imperceptible chink, through which the eye could just penetrate. Through this crevice a small room was visible, whitewashed and clean, but very bare of furniture. In one corner, near a small fire, sat an old man, leaning his head on his hands in a disconsolate attitude. The young girl was occupied in arranging the cottage, but presently she took something out of a drawer which employed her hands, and she sat down beside the old man, who, taking up an instrument, began to play, and to produce sounds sweeter than the voice of the thrush or of the nightingale. It was a lovely sight, even to me, poor wretch, who had never beheld aught beautiful before. The silver hair and benevolent countenance of the aged cottager won my reverence, while the gentle manners of the girl enticed my love. He played a sweet, mournful air, which I perceived drew tears from the eyes of his amiable companion, of which the old man took no notice, until she sobbed audibly. He then pronounced a few sounds, and the fair creature, leaving her work, knelt at his feet. He raised her and smiled with such kindness and affection that I felt sensations of a peculiar and overpowering nature. They were a mixture of pain and pleasure, such as I had never before experienced, either from hunger or cold, warmth or food, and I withdrew from the window, unable to bear these emotions. Soon after this, the young man returned, bearing on his shoulders a load of wood. The girl met him at the door, helped to relieve him of his burden, and, taking some of the fuel into the cottage, placed it on the fire. Then she and the youth went apart into a nook of the cottage, and he shewed her a large loaf and a piece of cheese. She seemed pleased, and went into the garden for some roots and plants, which she placed in water, and then upon the fire. She afterwards continued her work, whilst the young man went into the garden and appeared busily employed in digging and pulling up roots. After he had been employed thus about an hour, the young woman joined him, and they entered the cottage together. The old man had, in the meantime, been pensive, but, on the appearance of his companions, he assumed a more cheerful air, and they sat down to eat. The meal was quickly dispatched. The young woman was again occupied in arranging the cottage. The old man walked before the cottage in the sun for a few minutes, leaning on the arm of the youth. Nothing could exceed in beauty the contrast between these two excellent creatures. One was old, with silver hairs and a countenance beaming with benevolence and love. The younger was slight and graceful in his figure, and his features were molded with the finest symmetry. Yet his eyes and attitude expressed the utmost sadness and despondency. The old man returned to the cottage, and the youth, with tools different from those he had used in the morning, directed his steps across the field. Night quickly shut in, but, to my extreme wonder, I found that the cottagers had a means of prolonging light by the use of tapers, and was delighted to find that the setting of the sun did not put an end to the pleasure I experienced in watching my human neighbors. In the evening, the young girl and her companion were employed in various occupations which I did not understand, and the old man again took up the instrument, which produced the divine sounds that had enchanted me in the morning. So soon as he had finished, the youth began, not to play, but to utter sounds that were monotonous, and neither resembling the harmony of the old man's instrument or the songs of the birds. I since found that he read aloud, but at that time I knew nothing of the science of words or letters. The family, after having been thus occupied for a short time, extinguished their lights and retired, as I conjectured, to rest. End of chapter 3. All right, so we have our first part of Frankenstein's monsters story. So after he leaves Victor, aka Dr. Frankenstein's abode, he goes wandering around trying to find a nap. He finds some berries. They're delicious. He knows that he can not sustain on berries and accidentally discovers fire. And realizes that some things taste better when they are cooked. Not the berries, though. The berries were gross. So he keeps moving and finds a house that someone has abandoned, and he lives there for a little bit. But then they come back and he sort of leaves. And so he goes into a town, like a nearby town, and sees, so much going on. And he's like very interested in all of these other things. And he goes into one of the nicer looking houses, and the children all just like immediately start screaming out of terror, and like one of the women faint, and he's like, that's not cool. Little rude. I'm gonna see myself out. So he leaves, and then he finds a place that he's able to just sort of make a home. He's able to get water, he's able to get food, all that sort of thing, and he finds a neighbor. And this neighbor is a younger girl, and she is fetching milk and just sort of watches this family for the day. He sees that it's a family of 3, and yeah, he's like, oh, what is this? They're playing music. That's something I've never heard before. Oh, this person is speaking. Oh, he's reading aloud. Okay, got it. Oh, okay, cool. So they don't have to immediately go to bed. Once the sun goes down, they are able to extend their activities by using tapers, all these sorts of things. And then they go to sleep. Exactly. What's this? What's this? That would be a great crossover. Nightmare Before Christmas and Frankenstein. Amazing. He finds some babies. They were delicious. He doesn't know. He's just very curious. Sorry, dude. You just don't see an 8-foot tall yellow man every day. That's true. That's true. Also, immediately screaming when you see somebody is rude. Although he did, like, just walk into their home. You can't do that. You can't just walk into people's homes. That's not how it works. Sorry, my friend. Monster needs to learn some manners. He does. He's still learning, okay? It's not his fault that he was abandoned by Victor and just expected to understand everything. It's not how it works. Rude. All right. Chapter 4. I lay on my straw, but I could not sleep. I thought of the occurrences of the day. What chiefly struck me was the gentle manner of these people, and I longed to join them, but dared not. I remembered too well the treatment I had suffered the night before from the barbarous villagers, and resolved, whatever course of conduct I might hereafter think it right to pursue, that for the present I would remain quietly in my hovel, watching, and endeavoring to discover the motives which influenced their actions. I think it's interesting that he's like, these people are gentle, must observe. Must observe. The cottagers arose the next morning before the sun. The young woman arranged the cottage and prepared the food, and the youth departed for the first meal. This day was passed in the same routine as that which preceded it. The young man was constantly employed out of doors, and the girl in various laborious occupations within. The old man, whom I soon perceived to be blind, employed his leisure hours on his instrument or in contemplation. Nothing could exceed the love and respect which the younger cottagers exhibited towards their venerable companion. They performed towards him every little office of affection and duty with gentleness, and he rewarded them by his benevolent smiles. They were not entirely happy. Oh, there it is. The young man and his companion often went apart and appeared to weep. I saw no cause for their unhappiness, but I was deeply affected by it. If such lovely creatures were miserable, it was less strange that I, an imperfect and solitary being, should be wretched. Yet why were these gentle beings unhappy? They possessed a delightful house, for such it was in my eyes, and every luxury. They had a fire to warm them when chill, and delicious viands when hungry. They were dressed in excellent clothes, and, still more, they enjoyed one another's company and speech, interchanging each day looks of affection and kindness. What did their tears imply? Did they really express pain? I was at first unable to solve these questions, but perpetual attention and time explained to me many appearances which were at first enigmatic. A considerable period elapsed before I discovered one of the causes of the uneasiness of this amiable family. It was poverty, and they suffered that evil in a very distressing degree. Their nourishment consisted entirely of the vegetables of their garden, and the milk of one cow who gave very little during the winter, when its masters could scarcely procure food to support it. They often, I believe, suffered the pangs of hunger very poignantly, especially the two younger cottagers, for several times they placed food before the old man, when they reserved none for themselves. Oh, that's sad. This trait of kindness moved me sensibly. I had been accustomed, during the night, to steal a part of their store for my own consumption, but when I found that in doing this I inflicted pain on the cottagers, I abstained, and satisfied myself with berries, nuts, and roots, which I gathered from a neighboring wood. I discovered also another means through which I was enabled to assist their laborers. I found that the youth spent a great part of each day in collecting wood for the family fire, and, during the night, I often took his tool, the use of which I quickly discovered, and brought home firing sufficient for the consumption of several days. Oh, I remember, the first time that I did this, the young woman, when she opened the door in the morning, appeared greatly astonished on seeing a great pile of wood on the ground. She uttered some words in a loud voice, and the youth joined her, who also expressed surprise. I observed, with pleasure, that he did not go to the forest that day, but spent it in repairing the cottage and cultivating the garden. He's being so helpful. By degrees, I made a discovery of still greater moment. I found that these people possessed a method of communicating their experience and feelings to one another by articulate sounds. I perceived that the words they spoke sometimes produced pleasure or pain, smiles or sadness, in the hearts and countenances of the hearers. This was indeed a godlike science, and I ardently desired to become acquainted with it. But I was baffled in every attempt I made for this purpose. Their pronunciation was quick, and the words they uttered not having any apparent connection with visible objects, I was unable to discover any clue by which I could unravel the mystery of their reference. By great application, however, and after having remained during the space of several revolutions of the moon in my hovel, I discovered the names that were given to some of the most familiar objects of discourse. I learned and applied the words fire, milk, bread, and wood. I learned also the names of the cottagers themselves. The youth and his companion had each of them several names, but the old man had only one, which was father. The girl was called sister, or Agatha, and the youth Felix, brother, or son. I cannot describe the delight I felt when I learned the ideas appropriated to each of these sounds and was able to pronounce them. I distinguished several other words, without being able as yet to understand or apply them, such as good, dearest, unhappy. I spent the winter in this manner. The gentle manners and beauty of the cottagers greatly endeared them to me. When they were unhappy, I felt depressed. When they rejoiced, I sympathized with their joys. I saw few human beings besides them, and if any other happened to enter the cottage, their harsh manners and rude gait only enhanced to me the superior accomplishments of my friends. The old man, I could perceive, often endeavored to encourage his children, as sometimes I found that he called them, to cast off their melancholy. He would talk in a cheerful accent, with an expression of goodness that bestowed pleasure even upon me. Agatha listened with respect. Her eyes sometimes filled with tears, which she endeavored to wipe away unperceived, but I generally found that her countenance and tone were more cheerful after having listened to the exhortations of her father. It was not thus with Felix. He was always the saddest of the group, and even to my unpractised senses he appeared to have suffered more deeply than his friends. But if his countenance was more sorrowful, his voice was more cheerful than that of his sister, especially when he addressed the old man. I could mention innumerable instances, which, although slight, marked the dispositions of these amiable cottagers. In the midst of poverty and want, Felix carried with pleasure to his sister the first little white flower that peeped out from beneath the snowy ground. Early in the morning, before she had risen, he cleared away the snow that obstructed her path to the milk-house, drew water from the well, and brought the wood from the outhouse, where, to his perpetual astonishment, he found his store always replenished by an invisible hand. In the day, I believe, he worked sometimes for a neighboring farmer, because he often went forth and did not return until dinner, yet brought no wood with him. At other times he worked in the garden, but as there was little to do in the frosty season, he read to the old man and Agatha. This reading had puzzled me extremely at first. By degrees, I discovered that he uttered many of the same sounds when he read as when he talked. I conjectured, therefore, that he found on the paper signs for speech which he understood, and I ardently longed to comprehend these too. But how was that possible, when I did not even understand the sounds for which they stood as signs? I improved, however, sensibly in this science, but not sufficiently to follow up any kind of conversation, although I applied my whole mind to the endeavor, for I easily perceived that, although I eagerly longed to discover myself to the cottagers, I ought not to make the attempt until I had first become master of their language, which knowledge might enable me to make them overlook the deformity of my figure, for with this also the contrast perpetually presented to my eyes had made me acquainted. I had admired the perfect forms of my cottagers, their grace, beauty, and delicate complexions, but how was I terrified when I viewed myself in a transparent pool. At first I started back, unable to believe that it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror, and when I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification. Alas, I did not yet entirely know the fatal effects of this miserable deformity. As the sun became warmer, and the light of day longer, the snow vanished, and I beheld the bare trees and the black earth. From this time Felix was more employed, and the heart-moving indications of impending famine disappeared. Their food, as I afterwards found, was coarse, but it was wholesome, and they procured a sufficiency of it. Several new kinds of plants sprung up in the garden, which they dressed, and these signs of comfort increased daily as the season advanced. The old man, leaning on his son, walked each day at noon, when it did not rain, as I found it was called when the heavens poured forth its waters. This frequently took place, but a high wind quickly dried the earth, and the season became far more pleasant than it had been. My mode of life in my hovel was uniform. During the morning I attended the motions of the cottagers, and when they were dispersed in various occupations, I slept. The remainder of the day was spent in observing my friends. When they had retired to rest, if there was any moon, or the night was starlight, I went into the woods and collected my own food and fuel for the cottage. When I returned, as often as it was necessary, I cleared their path from the snow, and performed those offices that I had seen done by Felix. I afterwards found that these labors, performed by an invisible hand, greatly astonished them, and once or twice I heard them on these occasions utter the words, "Good spirit," "wonderful," but I did not then understand the signification of these terms. You could just say significance, but that's fine. My thoughts now became more active, and I longed to discover the motives and feelings that these lovely creatures. I was inquisitive to know why Felix appeared so miserable, and Agatha so sad. I thought, foolish wretch, that it might be in my power to restore happiness to these deserving people. When I slept or was absent, the forms of the venerable blind father, the gentle Agatha, and the excellent Felix flitted before me. I looked upon them as superior beings, who would be the arbiters of my future destiny. I formed in my imagination 1,000 pictures of presenting myself to them and their reception of me. I imagined that they would be disgusted, until, by my gentle demeanor and conciliating words, I should first win their favor, and afterwards their love. That is a great action plan. I see no faults, and nothing could possibly go wrong with this. These thoughts exhilarated me, and led me to apply with fresh ardor to the acquiring the art of language. My organs were indeed harsh, but supple, and although my voice was very unlike the soft music of their tones, yet I pronounced such words as I understood with tolerable ease. It was as the ass and the lapdog, yet surely the gentle ass, whose intentions were affectionate, although his manners were rude, deserved better treatment than blows and execration. The pleasant showers and genial warmth of spring greatly altered the aspect of the earth. Men, who before this change seemed to have been hid in caves, dispersed themselves, and were employed in various arts of cultivation. The birds sang in more cheerful notes, and the leaves began to bud forth on the trees. Happy, happy earth! Fit habitation for gods, which, so short a time before, was bleak and damp and unwholesome. My spirits were elevated by the enchanting appearance of nature. The past was blotted from my memory, the present was tranquil, and the future gilded by bright rays of hope and anticipations of joy. End of chapter 4. All right, so our good old Frankenstein's monster is still observing this fine family, and is just very interested in them. They're happy, and he's like, what is this? People can be gentle. They don't have to be upset and hostile and barbaric all the time. Must observe. So he's observing them, and he also realizes that they're really sad, but they're not sad in front of each other. And he's like, I need to know what is happening. And he eventually figures out that they are very poor. And so he's determined to help them. Without showing himself, because he does find out that he is scary. He does not look like regular people. He saw himself into like a clear like pond, and he's like, good lord, I am scary. which I think that when I wake up as well. I get it. Um, and so he does little chores to make their life a little easier. So instead of the boy having to spend most of his time chopping wood, he does it. Frankenstein's monster does it in the middle of the night and like presents them with wood in the morning instead of the and then so the like the young man could do other things like fixing the roof and like all of these other things. He also realizes that in the snow times or winter as some people call it, they have to like shovel or like clear snow out for the paths, so he does that as well. And so Frankenstein's monster rearranges his schedule to sort of fit into theirs. So he sleeps not at night, but when they are off doing their own activities, and does all of this like extra work. And the family doesn't know who it is, they just think that it's a wonderful miracle. And slowly, Frankenstein's monster is learning words. He's learned bread, fire, those types of things. He's really intrigued by reading, but he's like, how am I going to read? I don't even know what the words that they're saying mean. Like I have no association to what it is. Um, but he is determined to learn the language so that he can help them further. And that's cute. Cute. Don't let him see Twitter. Exactly. Keep him away. Keep him wholesome. All right. Chapter 5. Just kidding. Hold on. Gotta replenish. Chapter 5. I now hasten to the more moving part of my story. I shall relate events that impressed me, with feelings which, from what I was, have made me what I am. Spring advanced rapidly. The weather became fine and the skies cloudless. It surprised me that what before was desert and gloomy should now bloom with the most beautiful flowers and verdure. Verdure. My senses were gratified and refreshed by 1,000 scents of delight and 1,000 sights of beauty. It was on one of these days, when my cottager periodically rested from labor. The old man played on his guitar, and the children listened to him. I observed that the countenance of Felix was melancholy beyond expression. He sighed frequently, and once his father paused in his music, and I conjectured by his manner that he inquired the cause of his son's sorrow. Felix replied in a cheerful accent, and the old man was recommencing his music, when someone tapped at the door. It was a lady on horseback, accompanied by a countryman as a guide. The lady was dressed in a dark suit and covered with a thick black veil. Agatha asked a question, to which the stranger only replied by pronouncing, in a sweet accent, the name of Felix. Her voice was musical, but unlike that of either of my friends. On hearing this word, Felix came up hastily to the lady, who, when she saw him, threw up her veil, and I beheld a countenance of angelic beauty and expression. Her hair of a shining raven black, and curiously braided. Her eyes were dark but gentle, although animated. Her features of a regular proportion, and her complexion wondrously fair, each cheek tinged with a lovely pink. Felix seemed ravished with delight when he saw her. Every trait of sorrow vanished from his face, and it instantly expressed a degree of ecstatic joy, of which I could hardly have believed it capable. His eyes sparkled as his cheek flushed with pleasure, and at that moment I thought him as beautiful as the stranger. She appeared affected by different feelings, wiping a few tears from her lovely eyes. She held out her hand to Felix, who kissed it rapturously, and called her, as well as I could distinguish, his sweet Arabian. She did not appear to understand him, but smiled. He assisted her to dismount, and, dismissing her guide, conducted her into the cottage. Some conversation took place between him and his father, and the young stranger knelt at the old man's feet and would have kissed his hand, but he raised her and embraced her affectionately. I soon perceived that although the stranger uttered articulate sounds and appeared to have a language of her own, she was neither understood by, or herself understood, the cottagers. They made many signs which I did not comprehend, but I saw that her presence diffused gladness through the cottage, dispelling their sorrows as the sun dissipates the morning mists. Felix seemed particularly happy, and with smiles of delight welcomed his Arabian. Why do we have to refer to her as Arabian? Well, I guess we don't know the relationship yet, but still, I feel like we could use some other words to describe. That's fine. Agatha, the ever gentle Agatha, kissed the hands of the lovely stranger, and, pointing to her brother, made signs which appeared to me to mean that he had been sorrowful until she came. Some hours passed thus, while they, by their countenances, expressed joy, the cause of which I did not comprehend. Presently I found, by the frequent recurrence of one sound which the stranger repeated after them, that she was endeavoring to learn their language, and the idea instantly occurred to me that I should make use of the same instructions to the same end. The stranger learned about 20 words at the first lesson. Most of them indeed were those which I had before understood, but I profited by the others. As night came on, Agatha and the Arabian retired early. When they separated, Felix kissed the hand of the stranger and said, "Good night, sweet Safie." He sat up much longer, conversing with his father, and by the frequent repetition of her name I conjectured that their lovely guest was the subject of their conversation. I ardently desired to understand them, and bent every faculty towards that purpose, but found it utterly impossible. The next morning Felix went out to his work, and after the usual occupations of Agatha were finished, the stranger sat at the feet of the old man, and taking his guitar, played some airs so entrancingly beautiful that they at once drew tears of sorrow and delight from my eyes. She sang, and her voice flowed in a rich cadence, swelling or dying away, like a nightingale of the woods. When she had finished, she gave the guitar to Agatha, who at first declined it. She played a simple air, and her voice accompanied it in sweet accents. But unlike the wondrous strain of the stranger, the old man appeared enraptured, and said some words, which Agatha endeavored to explain to Safie, and by which he appeared to wish to express that she bestowed on him the greatest delight by her music. You get the feeling that Mary Shelley was missing something, the way she constantly describes people as lovely and gentle and beautiful. Mm-hmm. The days now passed as peaceably as before, with the sole alteration that joy had taken place of sadness in the countenances of my friends. Safie was always happy. She and I improved rapidly in the knowledge of language, so that in 2 months I began to comprehend most of the words uttered by my protectors. In the meanwhile, also, the black ground was covered with herbage, and the green banks interspersed with innumerable flowers, sweet to the scent of the eyes, stars of pale radiance among the moonlight woods. The sun became warmer, the nights clear and balmy, and my nocturnal rambles were an extreme pleasure to me, although they were considerably shortened by the late setting and early rising of the sun. For I never ventured abroad during daylight, fearful of meeting with the same treatment as I had formerly endured in the first village which I entered. There are absolutely a lot of continences. So many continences. Everybody has had many continences, and we must note each time a continence happens. But you just gotta. You can't let a continence just go by without being announced. far too many. My days were spent in close attention, that I might more speedily master the language, and I may boast that I improved more rapidly than their stranger, who understood very little, and conversed in broken accents, whilst I comprehended and could imitate almost every word that was spoken. It's humble bragging. While I improved in speech, I also learned the science of letters, as it was taught to the stranger, and this opened before me a wild field of wonder and delight. The book from which Felix instructed Safie was Volney's Ruins of Empires. I should not have understood the purport of this book had not Felix, in reading it, given very minute explanations. He had chosen this work, he said, because the declamatory style was framed in imitation of the Eastern authors. Through this work I obtained a cursory knowledge of history, and a view of the several empires at present existing in the world. It gave me an insight into the manners, governments, and religions of the different nations of the earth. I heard the slothful Asiatics, of the stupendous genius and mental activity of the Grecians, of the wars and wonderful virtues of the early Romans, of their subsequent degeneration, of the decline of that mighty empire, of chivalry, Christianity, and knights. I heard of the discovery of the American hemisphere, and wept with Safie over the hapless fate of its original inhabitants. Just some gentle, light reading to start learning how to read. Just gonna start out nice and easy. These wonderful narrations inspired me with strange feelings. Was man, indeed, at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base? I love that Frankenstein's monster is describing man as base. Love it. He appeared at one time a mere scion of the evil principle, and at another so all that can be conceived of noble and godlike. To be a great and virtuous man appeared the highest honor that can befall a sensitive being. To be base and vicious, as many on record have been, appeared the lowest degradation. A condition more abject than that of the blind mole or harmless worm. For a long time I could not conceive how one man could go forth to murder his fellow, or even why there were laws and governments. But when I heard details of vice and bloodshed, my wonder ceased, and I turned away with disgust and loathing. Man is as basic as a pumpkin spice latte. Direct quote from the monster. Hair flip and all. Every conversation of the cottagers now opened new wonders to me. While I listened to the instructions which Felix bestowed upon the stranger, the strange system of human society was explained to me. I heard of the division of property, of immense wealth and squalid poverty, of rank descent and noble blood. The words induced me to turn towards myself. I learned that the possessions most esteemed by your fellow creatures were high and unsullied descent united with riches. A man might be respected with only one of these acquisitions, but without either he was considered, except in very rare instances, as a vagabond and a slave, doomed to waste his powers for the profit of the chosen few. And what was I? Of my creation and creator I was absolutely ignorant, but I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was, besides, endowed with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature as man. I was more agile than they, and could subsist upon coarser diet. I bore the extremes of heat and cold with less injury to my frame. My stature far exceeded theirs. When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled, and whom all men disowned? I cannot describe to you the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Oh, that I had forever remained in my native wood, nor known or felt beyond the sensations of hunger, thirst, and heat. Of what a strange nature is knowledge! It clings to the mind when it has once seized on it, like a lichen on the rock. I wished sometimes to shake off all thought and feeling, but I learned that there was but one means to overcome the sensation of pain, and that was death, a state which I feared yet did not understand. I admired virtue and good feelings, and loved the gentle manners and amiable qualities of my cottagers, but I was shut out from intercourse with them, except through means which I obtained by stealth, when I was unseen and unknown, and which rather increased than satisfied the desire I had of becoming one among my fellows. The gentle words of Agatha and the animated smiles of the charming Arabian were not for me. The mild exhortations of the old man and the lively conversation of the loved Felix were not for me. Miserable, unhappy wretch. Other lessons were impressed upon me even more deeply. I heard of the difference of sexes, of the birth and growth of children, how the father doted on the smiles of the infant, and the lively sallies of the older child, how all the life and cares of the mother were wrapped up in the precious charge, how the mind of youth expanded and gained knowledge of brother, sister, and all the various relationships which bind one human body to another in mutual bonds. But where were my friends and relations? No father had watched my infant days. No mother had blessed me with smiles and caresses, or if they had, all my past life was now a blot, a blind vacancy in which I distinguished nothing. From my earliest remembrance, I had been told as I then was in height and proportion. I had never yet seen a being resemble me, or who claimed any intercourse with me. What was I? The question again recurred, to be answered only with groans. I will soon explain to what these feelings tended, but allow me now to return to the cottagers, whose story excited in me such various feelings of indignation, delight, and wonder, but which all terminated in additional love and reverence for my protectors, for so I loved, in an innocent, half painful self-deceit, to call them. End of chapter 5. All right, so Frankenstein's monster is still just observing this family, still helping as much as possible, but being a secret in the shadow. It's like the secret Santa of every day. And one day they get a visitor, um, a very beautiful Arabian woman, and we don't know really who she is or what she's doing, and she doesn't really speak a lot of English, and they can't communicate with her either. So they welcome her into the home, and again, we don't know why, but then they start teaching her English and also how to read. And so Frankenstein's monster is like, excellent, this is my time to shine. I will also learn. And so he like humble bragged and was like, I am learning faster than this stranger. I'm doing great things. Um and yeah, like he's learning more and more about man based on the book that they are reading, which is the Ruins of Empires, Empires of Ruins, something like that. It's a foreign exchange student. Yes. Part of the program. And he's just confused by like how men can be so wonderful and noble and also so terrible and awful, and has learned already about classes, like if you're not highborn or have money or like all of these other things, then your whole life is to just survive or to please the the nobles and the highborn folk. Um, and he sort of is like doing his own introspection as well because he learns about families and friends and the relationships and stuff like that other people have, and he's like, well, I don't have that. I didn't have a dad watch me grow up. I don't have a mom doting on me, and just being like super excited, you know, with the joys in my life, all of these sorts of things. He's like, I don't have any friends. My life kind of sucks. And he just like super wants to be in their life and part of their happy but complicated world and accepted for who he is. Gosh darn it. Oh my gosh, I've almost drank a whole one of these. No wonder I needed a bio break. Goodness me. That's 20 ounces of water right there, my friends. He's good enough. He's smart enough. And doggone it, people like him. Yeah, it's very complex and complicated. And I do enjoy that Mary Shelley is having him watch and observe without knowing like anything about society or about man or language or anything like that, and just like observing through body language and figuring out their relationship, and then being an adult and learning about humanity. Like I always enjoy that type of storytelling. I think that's cool. Don't we all want that? Yes, we all do. The cottagers. I also enjoy that that's how they're described, as the cottagers. Because of course they are. They live in a cottage. They're cottagers. Duh. It is creepy. Especially since they're like not in a town. I think they're like farther out. It's weird. And why aren't these cottagers like investigating to see who is doing all of these things? I don't understand. Okay. Need to crisscross, apple them sauces. Yeah. All right. Chapter 6. Some time elapsed before I learned the history of my friends. It was one which could not fail to impress itself deeply on my mind, unfolding as it did a number of circumstances, each interesting and wonderful to one so utterly inexperienced as I was. Okay, so this has nothing to do, well, I guess it does have something to do with the story, but it's always interesting to me in books when somebody is like telling a story and there are no interruptions in the story. Maybe I'm just extremely rude, but when people tell me stories, I interrupt. I ask questions. I ask follow-up questions. I gotta know things. So seeing, just this is my story. Let me spin you a tale. And then it's just the whole thing without interruptions. It's wild to me. That is the fiction part of the story. I have found it, and it's that people don't interrupt when they're telling a story. Fiction. The name of the old man was De Lacy. He was descended from a good family in France, where he had lived for many years in affluence, respected by his superiors and beloved by his equals. His son was bred in the service of his country, and Agatha had ranked with ladies of the highest distinction. A few months before my arrival, they had lived in a large and luxurious city called Paris, surrounded by friends and possessed of every enjoyment which virtue, refinement of intellect, or taste, accompanied by a moderate fortune, could afford. The father of Safie had been the cause of their ruin. He was a Turkish merchant, and had inhabited Paris for many years, when, for some reason which I could not learn, he became obnoxious to the government. He was seized and cast into prison the very day that Safie arrived from Constantinople to join him. He was tried and condemned to death. The injustice of his sentence was very flagrant. All Paris was indignant, and it was judged that his religion and wealth, rather than the crime alleged against him, had been the cause of his condemnation. Felix had been present at the trial. His horror and indignation were uncontrollable when he heard the decision of the court. He made, at that moment, a solemn vow to deliver him, and then looked around for the means. After many fruitless attempts to gain admittance to the prison, he found a strongly grated window in an unguarded part of the building, which lighted the dungeon of the unfortunate Mahometan? I don't know where to put the stress on this one. He made, at that moment, a solemn vow to deliver him, and then looked round for the means. After many fruitless attempts to gain admittance to the prison, he found a strongly great. I already read the sentence. Excuse me, princess. Here it is. Felix visited the grate at night, and made known to the prisoner his intentions in his favor. The Turk, amazed and delighted, endeavored to kindle the zeal of his deliverer by promises of reward and wealth. Felix rejected his offers with contempt. Yet, when he saw the lovely Safie, who was allowed to visit her father, and who, by her gestures, expressed her lively gratitude, the youth could not help owning to his own mind that the captive possessed a treasure which could fully reward his toil and hazard. Is Safie the treasure? Safie's a person. The Turk quickly perceived the impression that his daughter had made on the heart of Felix, and endeavored to secure him more entirely in his interests, by the promise of her hand in marriage, as soon as he should be conveyed to a place of safety. Felix was too delicate to accept this offer, yet he looked forward to the probability of that event as to the consummation of his happiness. During the ensuing days, while the preparations were going forward for the escape of the merchant, the zeal of Felix was warmed by several letters that he received from this lovely girl, who found means to express her thoughts in the language of her lover, by the aid of an old man, a servant of her father's, who understood French. She thanked him in the most ardent terms for his intended services towards her father, and at the same time she gently deplored her own fate. I have copies of these letters, for I found means, during my residence in the hovel, to procure the implements of writing, and the letters were often in the hands of Felix or Agatha. Before I depart I will give them to you. They will prove the truth of my tale. But at present, as the sun is already far declined, I shall only have time to repeat the substance of them to you. Safie related that her mother was a Christian Arab, seized and made a slave by the Turks. Recommended by her beauty, she had won the heart of the father of Safie, who married her. The young girl spoke in high and enthusiastic terms of her mother, who, born in freedom, spurned the bondage of which she was now reduced. She instructed her daughter in the tenets of her religion, and taught her to aspire to higher powers of intellect, and an independence of spirit, forbidden to the female followers of Mahomet. This lady died, but her lessons were indelibly impressed on the mind of Safie, who sickened at the prospect of again returning to Asia, and the being immured within the walls of a harem, allowed only to occupy herself with. I know it's not Purell, but I really want to say Purell. puerile amusements, ill-suited to the temper of her soul, now accustomed to grand ideas and a noble emulation of virtue. Puerile. Childish, trifling, silly.
Puerile.
Ah, puerile. There we go. Now we know. Okay. Emulation for virtue. There we go. The prospect of marrying a Christian and remaining in a country where women were allowed to take a rank in society was enchanting to her. The day for the execution of the Turk was fixed, but on the night previous to it he had quitted prison, and before morning was distant many leagues from Paris. Felix had procured passports in the name of his father, sister, and himself. He had previously communicated his plan to the former, who aided the deceit by quitting his house, under the pretence of a journey, and concealed himself, with his daughter, in an obscure part of Paris. Felix conducted the fugitives through France to Lyons, and across Mount Cenis to Leghorn, where the merchant had decided to wait a favorable opportunity of passing into some part of the Turkish dominions. Safie resolved to remain with her father until the moment of his departure, before which time the Turk renewed his promise that she should be united to his deliverer, and Felix remained with them in expectation of that event, and in the meantime he enjoyed the society of the Arabian, who exhibited towards him the simplest and tenderest affection. They conversed with one another through the means of an interpreter, and sometimes with the interpretation of looks, and Safie sang to him the divine airs of her native country. The Turk allowed this intimacy to take place, and encouraged the hopes of the youthful lovers, while in his heart he had formed far other plans. He loathed the idea that his daughter should be united to a Christian, but he feared the resentment of Felix if he should appear lukewarm, for he knew that he was still in the power of his deliverer, if he should choose to betray him to the Italian state which they inhabited. He revolved 1,000 plans by which he should be enabled to prolong the deceit until it might be no longer necessary, and secretly to take his daughter with him when he departed. His plans were greatly facilitated by the news which arrived from Paris. The government of France were greatly enraged at the escape of their victim, and spared no pains to detect and punish his deliverer. The plot of Felix was quickly discovered, and De Lacy and Agatha were thrown into prison. The news reached Felix, and roused him from his dream of pleasure. His blind and aged father and his gentle sister lay in a noisome dungeon, while he enjoyed the free air and the society of her whom he loved. This idea was torture to him. He quickly arranged with the Turk, and that if the latter should find a favorable opportunity for escape before Felix could return to Italy, Safie should remain as a boarder at a convent at Leghorn, and then, quitting the lovely stranger, he hastened to Paris, and delivered himself up to the vengeance of the law, hoping to free De Lacy and Agatha by this proceeding. There's a lot of tangled webs we weave. There we go. In this little side story. It's a lot. It's quite the side story that we got going here. He did not succeed. They remained confined for 5 months before the trial took place, the result of which deprived them of their fortune, and condemned them to a perpetual exile from their native country. They found a miserable asylum in the cottage in Germany, where I discovered them. Felix soon learned that the treacherous Turk, for whom he and his family endured such unheard of oppression, on discovering that his deliverer was thus reduced to poverty and impotence, became a traitor to good feeling and honor, and had quitted Italy with his daughter, insultingly sending Felix a pittance of money to aid him, as he said, in some plan of future maintenance. Such were the events that preyed on the heart of Felix and rendered him, when I first saw him, the most miserable of his family. He could have endured poverty, and when this distress had been the meed of his future, he would have gloried in it. But the ingratitude of the Turk and the loss of his beloved Safie were misfortunes more bitter and irreparable. The arrival of the Arabian now infused new life into his soul. When the news reached Leghorn that Felix was deprived of his wealth and rank, the merchant commanded his daughter to think no more of her lover, but to prepare to return with him to her native country. The generous nature of Safie was outraged by this command. She attempted to expostulate with her father, but he left her angrily, reiterating his tyrannical mandate. A few days after, the Turk entered his daughter's apartment and told her hastily that he had reason to believe that his residence at Leghorn had been divulged, and that he should speedily be delivered up to the French government. He had, consequently, hired a vessel to convey him to Constantinople, for which city he should sail in a few hours. He intended to leave his daughter under the care of a confidential servant, to follow at her leisure with the greater part of his property, which had not yet arrived at Leghorn. When alone, Safie resolved in her own mind to the plan of conduct that it would become her to pursue in this emergency. A residence in Turkey was abhorrent to her. Her religion and feelings were alike adverse to it. But some papers of her father's, which fell into her hands, she heard of the exile of her lover, and learnt the name of the spot where he then resided. She hesitated some time, but at length she formed her determination. Taking with her some jewels that belonged to her, and a small sum of money, she quitted Italy with an attendant, a native of Leghorn, but who understood the common language of Turkey, and departed for Germany. She arrived in safety at a town about 20 leagues from the cottage of De Lacy, when her attendant fell dangerously ill. Safie nursed her with the most devoted affection, but the poor girl died, and the Arabian was left alone, unacquainted with the language of the country, and utterly ignorant of the customs of the world. She fell, however, into good hands. The Italian had mentioned the name of the spot for which they were bound, and, after her death, the woman of the house in which they had lived took care that Safie should arrive in safety at the cottage of her lover. End of chapter 6. Okay, so that was a lot of side story that may or may not have needed to be said. Okay, so now we have like backstory of Safie and why she's here. And it's just wild. It's weird. Okay, so there's like this whole like political thing. Safie's father was thrown into prison, and Felix goes there and is like gonna help him, and like instantly falls in love with his daughter, who's Safie. And the dad is like, well, if you get me to safety, or when I get to safety, you can marry my daughter. And he's like, oh boy, that's exciting news. Um, but then some like weird stuff happens, and the family, the like Felix, Agatha, and the papa are like shunned from their own country. So they have to leave, and they're stripped of all of their wealth, their glory, their nobility, all of that stuff. And Safie's dad hears of it and is like, no daughter of mine is gonna marry beneath her. Heck no, Safie. You cannot. I forbid it. And she's like, oh, but Papa, I love him so. And so like she leaves to go out and like find Felix and is just like couch surfing for a bit. Housers downgraded to cottagers. I should have just said that. That was the best way to describe it. Thank you. And so now she has finally made it through some tribulations and some trials. It sounds much better to say trials and tribulations instead of tribulations and trials, and I just realized this now. And I now understand why people say it that way. Shall we? Chapter 7. Such was the history of my beloved cottagers. It impressed me deeply. I learned, from the views of social life which it developed, to admire their virtues and to deprecate the vices of mankind. As yet I looked upon crime as a distant evil. Benevolence and generosity were ever present before me, inciting within me a desire to become an actor in the busy scene where so many admirable qualities were called forth and displayed. But, in giving an account of the progress of my intellect, I must not omit a circumstance which occurred in the beginning of the month of August of the same year. One night, during my accustomed visit to the neighboring wood, where I collected my own food and brought home firing for my protectors, I found on the ground a leathern portmanteau containing several articles of dress and some books. I eagerly seized the prize and returned with it to my hovel. Fortunately, the books were written in the language the elements of which I had acquired at the cottage. They consisted of Paradise Lost, a volume of Plutarch's Lives, and The Sorrows of Werter. The possession of these treasures gave me extreme delight. I now continually studied and exercised my mind upon these histories, whilst my friends were employed in their ordinary occupations. I can hardly describe to you the effect of these books. They produced in me an infinity of new images and feelings that sometimes raised me to ecstasy, but more frequently sunk me into the lowest dejection. In the Sorrows of Werter, besides the interest of its simple and affecting story, so many opinions are canvassed, and so many lights thrown upon what had hitherto been to me obscure subjects, that I found in it a never-ending source of speculation and astonishment. The gentle and domestic manners it described, combined with lofty sentiments and feelings which had for their object something out of self, accorded well with my experience among my protectors, and with the wants which were forever alive in my own bosom. But I thought Werter himself a more divine being than I had ever beheld or imagined. His character contained no pretension, but it sunk deep. The disquisitions upon death and suicide were calculated to fill me with wonder. I did not pretend to enter into the merits of the case, yet I inclined towards the opinions of the hero, whose extinction I wept, without precisely understanding it. As I read, however, I applied much personally to my own feelings and condition. I found myself similar, yet at the same time strangely unlike the beings concerning whom I read, and to whose conversation I was a listener. I sympathized with and partly understood them, but I was unformed in my mind. I was dependent on none, and related to none. The path of my departure was free, and there was none to lament my annihilation. My person was hideous, and my stature gigantic. What did this mean? Who was I? What was I? Whence did I come? What was my destination? These questions continually recurred, but I was unable to solve them. The volume of Plutarch's Lives, which I possessed, contained the histories of the first foundings of the ancient republics. This book had a far different effect upon me from the Sorrows of Werter. I learned from Werter's imaginations despondency and gloom, but Plutarch taught me high thoughts He elevated me above the wretched sphere of my own reflections, to admire and love the heroes of past ages. Many things I read surpassed my understanding and experience. I had a very confused knowledge of kingdoms, wide extents of country, mighty rivers, and boundless seas, but I was perfectly unacquainted with towns, and large assemblages of men. The cottage of my protectors had been the only school in which I had studied human nature, but this book developed new and mightier scenes of action. I read of men concerning in public affairs, governing or massacring their species. I felt the greatest ardor for virtue rise within me, an abhorrence for vice, as far as I understood the signification of those terms, relative as they were, as I applied them to pleasure and pain alone. Induced by these feelings, I was of course led to admire peaceable lawgivers, Numa, Solon, and Lycurgus, in preference to Romulus and Theseus. The patriarchal lives of my protectors caused these impressions to take a firm hold on my mind. Perhaps, if my first introduction to humanity had been made by a younger soldier, burning for glory and slaughter, I should have been imbued with different sensations. But Paradise Lost excited different and far deeper emotions. I read it, as I had read the other volumes which had fallen into my hands, as a true history. It moved every feeling of wonder and awe that the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures was capable of exciting. I often referred the several situations as their similarity struck me to my own. Like Adam, I was created apparently united by no link to any other being in existence, but his state was far different from mine in every other respect. He had come forth from the hands of God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the especial care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of a superior nature, but I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition, for often, like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose within me. Another circumstance strengthened and confirmed these feelings. Soon after my arrival in the hovel, I discovered some papers in the pocket of the dress which I had taken from your laboratory. At first I had neglected them, but now that I was able to decipher the characters in which they were written, I began to study them with diligence. It was your journal of the 4 months that preceded my creation. You minutely described in these papers every step you took in the progress of your work. This history was mingled with accounts of domestic occurrences. You, doubtless, recollect these papers. Here they are. Everything is related in them which bears reference to my accursed origin. The whole detail of that series of disgusting circumstances which produced it is set in view. The minutest description of my odious and loathsome person is given in language which painted your own horrors and rendered mine ineffaceable. I sickened as I read. Hateful day when I received life, I exclaimed in agony. Cursed Creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? God, in pity, made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid from its very resemblance. Satan had his companions, fellow devils, to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and detested. These were the reflections of my hours of despondency and solitude. But when I contemplated the virtues of the cottagers, their amiable and benevolent dispositions, I persuaded myself that when they should become acquainted with my admiration of their virtues, they would compassionate me, and overlook my personal deformity. Could they turn from their door one, however monstrous, who saluted their compassion and friendship? I resolved, at least, not to despair, but in every way to fit myself for an interview with them, which would decide my fate. I postponed this attempt for some months longer, for the importance attached to its success inspired me with a dread lest I should fail. Besides, I found that my understanding improved so much with every day's experience that I was unwilling to commence this undertaking until a few more months should have added to my wisdom. Several changes, in the meantime, took place in the cottage. The presence of Safie diffused happiness among its inhabitants, and I also found that a greater degree of plenty reigned there. Felix and Agatha spent more time in amusement and conversation, and were assisted in their labors by servants. They did not appear rich, but they were contented and happy. Their feelings were serene and peaceful, while mine became every day more tumultuous. Increase of knowledge only discovered to me more clearly that a wretched outcast I was. I cherished hope, it is true, but it vanished when I beheld my person reflected in water, or my shadow in the moonshine, even as that frail image and that inconstant shade. I endeavored to crush these fears, and to fortify myself for the trial which in a few months I resolved to undergo, and sometimes I allowed my thoughts, unchecked by reason, to ramble in the fields of paradise, and dared to fancy amiable and lovely creatures sympathizing with my feelings and cheering my gloom. Their angelic countenances breathed smiles of consolation. But it was all a dream. No Eve soothed my sorrows or shared my thoughts. I was alone. I remembered Adam's supplication to his Creator, but where was mine? He had abandoned me, and, in the bitterness of my heart, I cursed him. August passed thus. Autumn passed thus. I saw, with surprise and grief, the leaves decay and fall, and nature again assume the barren and bleak appearance it had worn when I first beheld the woods and the lovely moon. Yet I did not heed the bleakness of the weather. I was better fitted by my conformation for the endurance of cold than heat. But my chief delights were the sight of the flowers, the birds, and all the happy apparel of summer. When those deserted me, I turned with more attention towards the cottagers. Their happiness was not decreased by the absence of summer. They loved and sympathized with one another, and their joys, depending on each other, were not interrupted by the casualties that took place around them. The more I saw of them, the greater became my desire to claim their protection and kindness. My heart yearned to be known and loved by these amiable creatures, to see their sweet looks turned towards me with affection was the utmost limit of my ambition. I dared not think that they would turn them from me with disdain and horror. The poor that stopped at their door were never driven away. I asked, it is true, for greater treasures than a little food or rest. I required kindness and sympathy. I did not believe myself utterly unworthy of it. The winter advanced, and an entire revolution of the seasons had taken place since I awoke into life. My attention at this time was solely directed towards my plan of introducing myself to the cottage of my protectors. I revolved many projects, but that on which I finally fixed was to enter the dwelling with the blind man when the blind man should be alone. I had sagacity enough to discover that the unnatural hideousness of my person was the chief object of horror with those who had formerly beheld me. My voice, although harsh, had nothing terrible in it. I thought, therefore, that if, in the presence of his children, I could gain the goodwill and mediation of the old De Lacy, I might, by his means, be tolerated by my younger protectors. One day, when the sun shone on the red leaves that strewed the ground and diffused cheerfulness, although it denied warmth, Safie, Agatha, and Felix departed on a long country walk, and the old man, at his own desire, was left alone in the cottage. When his children had departed, he took up his guitar and played several mournful but sweet airs, more sweet and mournful than I had ever heard him play before. At first his countenance was illuminated with pleasure, but, as he continued, thoughtfulness and sadness succeeded. At length, laying aside the instrument, he sat absorbed in reflection. My heart beat quick. This was the hour and moment of trial, which would decide my hopes or realize my fears. The servants were gone to a neighboring fair. All was silent in and around the cottage. It was an excellent opportunity. Yet, when I proceeded to execute my plan, my limbs failed me, and I sunk to the ground. Again I rose, and, exerting all the firmness of which I was master, removed the planks which I had placed before my hovel to conceal my retreat. The fresh air revived me, and with renewed determination I approached the door of their cottage. I knocked. "Who's there?" said the old man. "Come in." I entered. "Pardon the intrusion," said I. "I am a traveler in want of a little rest. You would greatly oblige me if you would allow me to remain a few minutes before the fire." "Enter," said De Lacy, "and I will try in what manner I can relieve your wants. But, unfortunately, my children are from home, and as I am blind, I am afraid I shall find it difficult to procure food for you. Do not trouble yourself, my kind host. I have food. It is warmth and rest only that I need." I sat down, and a silence ensued. I knew that every minute was precious to me, yet I remained irresolute in what manner to commence the interview, when the old man addressed me. "By your language, stranger, I suppose you are my countryman. Are you French?" "No, but I was educated by a French family, and understood that language only. I am now going to claim the protection of some friends whom I sincerely love, and whose favor I have some hopes." "Are these Germans?" "No, they are French. But let us change the subject. I am an unfortunate and deserted creature. I look around, and I have no relation or friend upon earth. These amiable people to whom I go have never seen me, and know little of me. I am full of fears, for if I fail there, I am an outcast in the world forever." This is so stinking sad. "Do not despair. To be friendless is indeed to be unfortunate, but the hearts of men, when unprejudiced by any obvious self-interest, are full of brotherly love and charity. Rely, therefore, on your hopes, and if these friends are good and amiable, do not despair. They are kind. They are the most excellent creatures in the world, but unfortunately they are prejudiced against me. I have good dispositions. My life has been hitherto harmless, and, in some degree, beneficial. But a fatal prejudice clouds their eyes, and where they ought to see a feeling and kind friend, they behold only a detestable monster. That is indeed unfortunate. But if you are really blameless, cannot you undeceive them? I am about to undertake that task, and it is on that account that I feel so many overwhelming terrors. I tenderly love these friends. I have, unknown to them, been for many months in the habits of their daily kindness towards them, but they believe that I wish to injure them, and it is that prejudice which I wish to overcome." "Where do these friends reside?" "Near this spot." The old man paused, and then continued. "If you will unreservedly confide to me the particulars of your tale, I perhaps may be of use in undeceiving them. I am blind, and cannot judge of your countenance, but there is something in your words which persuades me that you are sincere. I am poor, and in exile, but it will afford me true pleasure to be in any way serviceable to a human creature." "Excellent man, I thank you, and accept your generous offer. You raise me from the dust by this kindness, and I trust that, by your aid, I shall not be driven from the society and sympathy of your fellow creatures. Heaven forbid, even if you are really criminal, for that can only drive you to desperation and not instigate you to virtue. I also am unfortunate. I and my family have been condemned, although innocent. Judge, therefore, if I do not feel for your misfortunes. How can I thank you, my best and only benefactor? From your lips first have I heard the voice of kindness directed towards me. I shall be forever grateful, and your present humanity assures me of success with those friends whom I am on the point of meeting. May I know the names and residence of those friends? Paused. This, I thought, was the moment of decision, which was to rob me of, or bestow happiness on me forever. I struggled vainly for firmness sufficient to answer him, but the effort destroyed all my remaining strength. I sank on the chair and sobbed aloud. At that moment I heard the steps of my younger protectors. I had not a moment to lose, but, seizing the hand of the old man, I cried, "Now is the time. Save and protect me. You and your family are the friends whom I seek. Do not you desert me in the hour of trial." "Great God!" exclaimed the old man. "Who are you?" At that instant the cottage door was opened, and Felix, Safie, and Agatha entered. Who can describe their horror and consternation on beholding me? Agatha fainted, and Safie, unable to attend to her friend, rushed out of the cottage. Felix darted forward, and with supernatural force tore me from his father, to whose knees I clung. In a transport of fury he dashed me to the ground and struck me violently with a stick. I could have torn him limb from limb as the lion rends an antelope. But my heart sunk within me as with bitter sickness, and I refrained. I saw him on the point of repeating his blow when, overcome by pain and anguish, I quitted the cottage, and in the general tumult escaped unperceived to my hovel. Oh, end of chapter 7. That was extremely sad. Okay, so our good friend Monster, has decided that he's been here for a year. He's helped this family. He now is able to communicate with them. He is going to ask to be friends, basically, for their help. And he's decided that the best way to do this is when the blind older man is by himself, when DeLacy is alone, because he won't be able to get the immediate reaction of how he looks and will be able to actually listen to him. So he goes in there and is talking with him, and DeLacy is being so, so nice to him, and our good friend Monster is like just so pleased and happy, and he's like, all right, yes, I will help you. I will talk to this family. I will talk to these people that you're trying to befriend, that sort of thing, because clearly you're not a bad person. And before our good friend Monster is able to say who it is that he is trying to win over, the younger of the families arrive, and immediately chaos ensues. Agatha faints, Safie runs out, or maybe it's reversed, I don't remember, and then Felix just starts like beating him up to like protect his father, because I'm sure it looks like, because Frankenstein like went on his knees and was like, please, you have to help me, like it's you, like you're the family that I'm trying to like befriend. And so I'm sure that from the outside it looks like his dad is being attacked by this 8-foot tall person who doesn't quite look like everybody else. And so Frankenstein Monster, our good friend Monster, is really sad about this. And instead of choosing violence, he leaves alone. That's super sad. That's what happens when you start having expectations. I know. And I feel like it was like a really good plan to be like, okay, I'm gonna get the dad to be on my side because he can't see. So of course he's not gonna immediately judge me. Like that was a solid plan. If you just had like a little bit more time and if he could explain a little bit more that his appearance is often what is offsetting people or off-putting people, then I feel like him and DeLacy could have come up with like a better plan as to how he's introduced to the youngins, to the chillins, but alas, that didn't happen. It's fine. All right, we do have time for one more chapter. Let's hit it. Chapter 8. I know. Cursed, cursed creator, why did I live? Why, in that instant, did I not extinguish the spark of existence which you had so wantonly bestowed? I know not. Despair had not yet taken possession of me. My feelings were those of rage and revenge. I could with pleasure have destroyed the cottage and its inhabitants, and have glutted myself with their shrieks and misery. When night came, I quitted my retreat and wandered in the woods. And now, no longer restrained by the fear of discovery, I gave vent to my anguish in fearful howlings. I was like a wild beast that had broken the toils, destroying the objects that obstructed me, and ranging through the wood with a stag-like swiftness. Oh, what a miserable night I passed! The cold stars shone in mockery, and the bare trees waved their branches above me. Now and then the sweet voice of bird burst forth amidst the universal stillness. All, save I, were at rest or enjoyment. I, like the arch-fiend, bore hell within me, and finding myself unsympathized with, wished to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin. But this was a luxury of sensation that could not endure. I became fatigued with excess of bodily exertion, and sank on the damp grass in the sick impotence of despair. There was none among the myriads of men that existed who would pity or assist me, and should I feel kindness towards my enemies? No. From that moment I declared everlasting war against the species, and, more than all, against him who had formed me and sent me forth to this unsupportable misery. The sun rose. I heard the voices of men and knew that it was impossible to return to my retreat during that day. Accordingly, I hid myself in some thick underwood, determining to devote the ensuing hours to reflection on my situation. The pleasant sunshine and the pure air of day restored me to some degree of tranquillity, and when I considered what had passed at the cottage, I could not help believing that I had been too hasty in my conclusions. I had certainly acted imprudently. It was apparent that my conversation had interested the father in my behalf, and I was a fool in having exposed my person to the horror of his children. I ought to have familiarized the old De Lacy to me, and by degrees have discovered myself to the rest of his family, when they should have been prepared for my approach. But I did not believe my errors to be irretrievable, and, after much consideration, I resolved to return to the cottage, seek the old man, and by my representations win him to my party. These thoughts calmed me, and in the afternoon I sank into a profound sleep. But the fever of my blood did not allow me to be visited by peaceful dreams. The horrible scene of the preceding day was forever acting before my eyes. The females were flying, and the enraged Felix tearing me from his father's feet. I awoke exhausted, and, finding that it was already night, I crept forth from my hiding place and went in search of food. When my hunger was appeased, I directed my steps towards the well-known path that conducted to the cottage. All there was at peace. I crept into my hovel and remained in silent expectation of the accustomed hour when the family arose. That hour passed. The sun mounted high in the heavens, but the cottagers did not appear. I trembled violently, apprehending some dreadful misfortune. The inside of the cottage was dark, and I heard no motion. I cannot describe the agony of this suspense. Presently 2 countrymen passed by, but, pausing near the cottage, they entered into conversation, using violent gesticulations, but I did not understand what they said, as they spoke the language of the country, which differed from that of my protectors. Soon after, however, Felix approached with another man. I was surprised, as I knew that he had not quitted the cottage that morning, and waited anxiously to discover, from his discourse, the meaning of these unusual appearances. "Do you consider," said his companion to him, "that you will be obliged to pay 3 months' rent and to lose the produce of your garden? I do not wish to take any unfair advantage, and I beg therefore that you will take some days to consider your determination." "It is utterly useless," replied Felix. "We can never again inhabit your cottage. The life of my father is in the greatest danger, owing to the dreadful circumstance that I have related. My wife and my sister will never recover their horror. I entreat you not to reason with me any more. Take possession of your tenement, and let me fly from this place." Felix trembled violently as he said this. He and his companion entered the cottage, in which they remained for a few minutes, and then departed. I never saw any of the family of De Lacy more. I continued for the remainder of the day in my hovel in a state of utter and stupid despair. My protectors had departed, and had broken the only link that held me to the world. For the first time the feelings of revenge and hatred filled my bosom, and I did not strive to control them, but, allowing myself to be borne away by the stream, I bent my mind towards injury and death. When I thought of my friends, of the mild voice of De Lacy, the gentle eyes of Agatha, and the exquisite beauty of the stranger, these thoughts vanquished, and a gush of tears somewhat soothed me. But again, when I reflected that they had spurned and deserted me, anger returned, a rage of anger, and, unable to endure anything human, I turned my fury towards inanimate objects. As night advanced, I placed a variety of combustibles around the cottage, and, after having destroyed every vestige of cultivation in the garden, I waited with forced impatience until the moon had sunk to commence my operations. As the night advanced, a fierce wind arose from the woods, and quickly dispersed the clouds that had loitered the heavens. The blast tore along like a mighty avalanche, and produced a kind of insanity in my spirits that burst all bounds of reason and reflection. I lighted the dry branch of a tree, and danced with fury around the devoted cottage, my eyes still fixed on the western horizon, the edge of which the moon nearly touched. A part of its orb was at length hid, and I waved my brand. It stunk, and, with a loud scream, I fired the straw, and heath, and bushes which I had collected. The wind fanned the fire, and the cottage was quickly enveloped by the flames which clung to it, and licked it with their forked and destroying tongues. As soon as I was convinced that no assistance could save any part of the habitation, I quitted the scene, and sought for refuge in the woods. And now, with the world before me, whither should I bend my steps? I resolved to fly far from the scene of my misfortunes. But to me, hated and despised, every country must be equally horrible. At length the thought of you crossed my mind. I learned from your papers that you were my father, my creator, and to whom could I apply with more fitness than to him who had given me life? Among the lessons that Felix had bestowed upon Sapphy geography had not been omitted. I had learned from these relative situations of the different countries of the earth. You had mentioned Geneva as the name of your native town, and towards this place I resolved to proceed. But how was I to direct myself? I knew that I must travel in a southwesterly direction to reach my destination, but the sun was my only guide. I did not know the names of the towns that I was to pass through, nor could I ask information from a single human being. But I did not despair. From you only could I hope to succor, although towards you I felt no sentiment but that of hatred. Unfeeling, heartless creator. You had endowed me with perceptions and passions, and then cast me abroad, an object for the scorn and horror of mankind. But on you only had I any claim for pity and redress, and from you I determined to seek that justice which I vainly attempted to gain from any other being that wore the human form. My travels were long, and the sufferings I endured intense. It was late in autumn when I quitted the district where I had so long resided. I traveled only at night, fearful of encountering the visage of a human being. Nature decayed around me, and the sun became heatless. Rain and snow poured around me. Mighty rivers were frozen. The surface of the earth was hard and chill and bare, and I found no shelter. On earth, how often did I imprecate curses on the cause of my being. The mildness of my nature had fled, and all within me was turned to gall and bitterness. The nearer I approached to your habitation, the more deeply did I feel the spirit of revenge enkindled in my heart. Snow fell, and the waters were hardened, but I rested not. A few incidents now and then directed me, and I possessed a map of the country. But I often wandered wide from my path. The agony of my feelings allowed me no respite. No incident occurred from which my rage and misery could not extract its food. But a circumstance that happened when I arrived on the confines of Switzerland, when the sun had recovered its warmth, and the earth began again to look green, confirmed in a special manner the bitterness and horror of my feelings. I generally rested during the day, and traveled only when I was secured by night from the view of man. One morning, however, finding that my path lay through a deep wood, I ventured to continue my journey after the sun had risen. The day, which was one of the first of spring, cheered even me by the loveliness of its sunshine and the balminess of the air. I felt emotions of gentleness and pleasure that had long appeared dead, revived within me. Half surprised by the novelty of these sensations, I allowed myself to be borne away by them, and, forgetting my solitude and deformity, dared to be happy. Soft tears again bedewed my cheeks, and I even raised my humid eyes with thankfulness towards the blessed sun, which bestowed such joy upon me. I continued to wind among the paths of the wood until I came to its boundary, which was skirted by a deep and rapid river, into which many of these trees bent their branches, now budding with the fresh spring. Here I paused, not exactly knowing what path to pursue, when I heard the sound of voices that induced me to conceal myself under the shade of a cypress. I was scarcely hid, when a young girl came running towards the spot where I was concealed, laughing as if she ran from someone in sport. She continued her course along the precipitous side of the river, when suddenly her foot slipped, and she fell into the rapid stream. I rushed from my hiding place, and with extreme labor from the force of the current saved her, and dragged her to shore. She was senseless, and I endeavored by every means in my power to restore animation, when I was suddenly interrupted by the approach of a rustic, who was probably the person from whom she was playfully fled. On seeing me, he darted towards me, and, tearing the girl from my arms, hastened toward the deeper parts of the wood. I followed speedily. I hardly knew why, but when the man saw me draw near, he aimed a gun which he carried at my body and fired. I sunk to the ground, and my injurer, with increased swiftness, escaped into the wood. This was then the reward of my benevolence. I had saved a human being from destruction, and, as a recompense, I now writhed under the miserable pain of a wound which shattered the flesh and bone. The feelings of kindness and gentleness which I had entertained but a few moments before gave place to hellish rage and gnashing of teeth. Inflamed by pain, I vowed eternal hatred and vengeance to all mankind. But the agony of my wound overcame me, and my pulses paused, and I fainted. For some weeks I led a miserable life in the woods, endeavoring to cure the wound which I had received. The ball had entered my shoulder, and I knew not whether it had remained there or passed through. At any rate, I had no means of extracting it. My sufferings were augmented also by the oppressive sense of the injustice and ingratitude of their infliction. My daily vows rose for revenge, a deep and deadly revenge, such as would alone compensate for the outrages and anguish I had endured. After some weeks my wound healed, and I continued my journey. The labors I endured were no longer to be alleviated by the bright sun or gentle breezes of spring. All joy was but a mockery, which insulted my desolate estate, and made me feel more painfully that I was not made for the enjoyment of pleasure. But my toils now drew near a close, and 2 months from this time I reached the environs of Geneva. It was evening when I arrived, and I retired to a hiding place among the fields that surround it. To meditate in what manner I should apply to you, I was oppressed by fatigue and hunger, and far too unhappy to enjoy the gentle breezes of evening or the prospect of the sun setting behind the stupendous mountains of Jura. At this time a slight sleep relieved me from the pain of reflection, which was disturbed by the approach of a beautiful child, who came running into the recess I had chosen with all the supportiveness of infancy. Suddenly, as I gazed on him, an idea seized me, that this little creature was unprejudiced, and had lived too short a time to have imbibed a horror of deformity. If, therefore, I could seize him and educate him as my companion and friend, I should not be so desolate in this peopled earth. Urged by this impulse, I seized on the boy as he passed, and drew him towards me. As soon as he beheld my form, he placed his hands before his eyes. He placed and uttered a shrill scream. I drew his hand forcibly from his face and said, "Child, what is the meaning of this? I do not intend to hurt you. Listen to me." He struggled violently. "Let me go!" he cried. "Monster! Ugly wretch! You wish to eat me and tear me to pieces! You are an ogre! Let me go, or I will tell my papa!" "Boy, you will never see your father again. You must come with me." "Hideous monster! Let me go! My papa is is a what? Is a syndic? He is M. Frankenstein. He would punish you. You dare not keep me." Bum, bum, bum. 'Tis Victor's brother. Frankenstein, you belong then to my enemy, to him towards whom I have sworn eternal revenge. You shall be my first victim. The child still struggled, and loaded me with epithets which carried despair to my heart. I grasped his throat to silence him, and in a moment he lay dead at my feet. I gazed on my victim, and my heart swelled with exultation and hellish triumph. Clapping my hands, I exclaimed, "I, too, can create desolation. My enemy is not impregnable. This death will carry despair to him, and 1,000 other miseries shall torment and destroy him." As I fixed my eyes on the child, I saw something glittering on his breast. I took it. It was a portrait of a most lovely woman. In spite of my malignity, it softened and attracted me. For a few moments I gazed with delight on her dark eyes, fringed by deep lashes, and her lovely lips. But presently my rage returned. I remembered that I was forever deprived of the delights that such beautiful creatures could bestow, and that she whose resemblance I contemplated would, in regarding me, have changed that air of divine benignity to one expressive of disgust and affright. Can you wonder that such thoughts transported me with rage? I only wonder that at that moment, instead of venting my sensations in exclamations and agony, I did not rush among mankind and perish in the attempt to destroy them. While I was overcome by these feelings, I left the spot where I had committed the murder, and was seeking a more secluded hiding place, when I perceived a woman passing near me. She was young, not indeed so beautiful as her whose portrait I held, but of an agreeable aspect, and blooming in the loveliness of youth and health. Here, I thought, as one of those whose smiles are bestowed on all but me, she shall not escape, thanks to the lessons of Felix and the sanguinary laws of man. I have learned how to work mischief. I approached her unperceived and placed the portrait securely in one of the folds of her dress. For some days I haunted the spot where these scenes had taken place, sometimes wishing to see you, sometimes resolved to quit the world and its miseries forever. At length I wandered towards these mountains, and have ranged through their immense recesses, consumed by a burning passion which you alone can gratify. We may not part until you have promised to comply with my requisition. I am alone and miserable. Man will not associate with me, but one as deformed and horrible as myself would not deny herself to me. My companion must be of the same species, and have the same defects. This being you must create. End of chapter 8. Bum, bum, bum. All right, so in this chapter, Frankenstein's monster, after running away from the DeLacy family, realizes, oh, I should have done it slower. I should have made my appearance on a more gradual scale to the DeLacy children. I'm going to go back. And I'm going to do this again. I'm going to get the old man Lacey back on my side, and things will be amazing and all right, and I'll have friends. So he goes back, and about the time that he knows that they usually wake up, nothing happens, and the cottage is still really dark. And it turns out that the DeLacy family is selling their home, and they're moving, because Papa DeLacy was attacked by a hideous monster, and they need to leave. They can never live here ever again for any longer. So they move, and our good friend Monster is distraught. He is so upset. And he doesn't take out his anger on anything living. Well, no humans, no animals. He destroys the DeLacy crops, and he destroys their cottage. And he leaves. And he finds that Victor Frankenstein, his hometown is Geneva, and he knows that it's to the west, and so he starts heading west, not knowing how far west, not knowing which part of west, nothing like that. He just heads out. And on his journey, he sees this young girl who is, playfully fleeing. I don't know. She's fleeing somebody, and she falls into the river, and it's a very fast current. And so our good friend Monster jumps in to save her, brings her out, and is trying to like reanimate her, bring breath back into her. And the person that she was fleeing finds them, is terrified, like grabs her, runs into the woods, and our good friend Monster is like, okay, well, I'm gonna follow them. I need to make sure that she's okay. So he follows them, like runs after them through the woods. The guy turns around, aims a gun at him, and shoots him. And so now he is just enraged. He just tried to help somebody to save her life, and his reward is being shot at and shot and wounded. So he's super peeved. And so he just decides, like, even more so, that that this is all Victor's fault. This is all his creator's fault. And he needs to find him now. So he goes there, or he keeps on his journey, and he runs across this little boy, and he's like, oh, okay, perfect. Someone who is super small and will not have the prejudices that adults have. I can make this kid my friend. I'm not going to be scary to him because he's just not old enough to be scared. Of course, the kid is scared, and he tries to like be like, no, no, like we're gonna be friends, like you're never gonna see your dad again, it'll be fine, we'll be besties. And the kid is like, my dad, Frankenstein, will come after you. And he's like, hold up, you're a Frankenstein? And then he murders the little boy, and he finds in his pocket the picture of of Mama Frankenstein, and she's just so beautiful. And he is even more upset because he will never experience that, because nobody will ever love him because of how he looks. And so he gets rid of the picture and he puts it into, I forgot her name. Francine, is that Justine? In Justine's dress, and that's how we come to her being accused of the murder, all of that sort of thing. And here we are. And so he's like, all right, Frankenstein, my dude, I'm not gonna let you leave until I'm no longer lonely. You need to make me a companion. And that's where we ended. And that's going to be it for tonight. What perfect timing. We will pick up right at part 2, chapter 9 next time. Oh, thank you very much for being here. I hope you all have a great night. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. If I do not see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Have a good night, my friends. Bye.